The church was filled with a mixture of anticipation and growing unease. The bride, Susan, stood at the altar, her fingers trembling as she clutched her bouquet. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow. Where was he? The love of her life, the man she had dreamed of marrying, was nowhere to be seen. The murmurs from the congregation were growing louder, their whispers carrying doubt and frustration. Susan's panic turned to desperation. She had called his best friend, the best man, and everyone she thought might be with him. Each call went unanswered, and her heart sank further with every failed attempt. She glanced at the door, hoping he would walk in, apologetic but smiling, ready to take her hand. But he didn't. The hotel where he had been staying was just down the road. It wasn't far, but the minutes dragged on like hours. The guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some quietly leaving, shaking their heads. Finally, the priest approached her with an expression that confirmed her worst fear. "We can't wait any longer," he said gently. "The wedding will have to be postponed." Susan's knees gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her white dress pooling around her like a symbol of her shattered hopes. Tears spilled from her eyes as she whispered, "This can't be happening." Her mother rushed to her side, pulling her into an embrace. "Don't panic, my daughter," her mother said softly but firmly. "We need to find out what happened." With renewed urgency, Susan and her mother got into a car and drove toward the hotel. The streets felt unusually quiet, almost foreboding. But then, as they neared the hotel, they saw it. A crowd of people gathered by the roadside, their faces filled with shock and sorrow. Susan's heart sank. The car. It was unmistakable. It belonged to him. Her hands gripped the door handle, trembling. "Stop!" she cried to the driver. Without waiting, she leaped out of the car and ran toward the scene, her heels clicking against the pavement. The sight was devastating. The car was crushed, the metal twisted like a crumpled piece of paper. Blood stained the ground, and the air smelled of burnt rubber and despair. A kind-looking elderly woman approached her, her face etched with pity. "The car was involved in a terrible accident," the woman said. "The driver and another man were unconscious. They were taken to the hospital, but it didn't look good." Susan froze, her mind rejecting the words. "No, no, no," she cried, clutching her chest. "This is a dream. Please let this be a dream." Her best friend and her mother caught up with her, holding her as her legs gave way. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. "We have to go to the hospital," her mother said firmly, wiping her tears. When they arrived at the hospital, the stark white walls and the smell of antiseptic hit Susan like a wall. Her stomach churned as she approached the reception desk. "Please," she begged the nurse, her voice cracking. "Where is my husband? Tell me he's okay." The nurse hesitated, her sympathetic eyes filling Susan with dread. "He's in the ICU," she finally said. Susan nearly collapsed again, but her mother's strong arms kept her upright. "We're here, Susan," her mother whispered. "Let's go." In the ICU, the sight of him shattered her. He was hooked to machines, his face pale and his body still. The beeping of the monitors was a cruel reminder that life still clung to him, but only just. In the next bed, the best man lay, his face unrecognizable from the swelling and bruises. "What happened?" Susan managed to ask the doctor who approached them. The doctor's face was grim. "There was a fatal car accident," he explained. "Your husband is in critical condition, and he's currently in a coma. We're doing everything we can, but—" His voice trailed off. Susan's heart broke. She sank to her knees beside her husband's bed, clutching his hand as tears streamed down her face. "Wake up," she whispered. "Please wake up. We were supposed to get married today. You can't leave me." Her mother knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her. "We will get through this," she said, her voice soft but firm. But even she couldn't hide the tears in her eyes. The hours dragged on. Susan refused to leave the hospital. Despite her mother's pleas to go home and rest, she stayed, sitting beside her husband, watching every rise and fall of his chest as if her gaze alone could keep him alive. The next morning, the doctor approached her again, his expression heavy with sorrow. "He's still in a coma," he said. "It will take time, but we're hopeful. However," he hesitated. "I'm sorry, but the best man didn't make it. He passed away early this morning." The weight of the words crushed Susan further. The man who had been part of their happiest memories was now gone. She held her husband's hand tighter, tears streaming freely. The best man's wife stood there, shaking with uncontrollable grief and anger. Her voice, raw with pain, pierced through the hospital walls. "You killed my husband! You've turned me into a widow at just 24. What am I supposed to do now? Who will take care of our children? Who will take care of me?" she screamed, her words heavy with anguish and desperation. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted her premonition. "I warned him. I told him not to go to that wedding. I begged him. I had a bad feeling about it, but he wouldn't listen. He said he had to be there for his best friend, his childhood friend." Her voice cracked, the weight of her loss too much to bear. The hospital room erupted into pandemonium when she lunged at the bride, her fingers clawing, fury and heartbreak driving her actions. The bride's mother and nurses rushed to intervene, holding her back as she sobbed uncontrollably. "Please, ma'am, this isn't the bride's fault," a nurse pleaded gently, trying to calm the storm. But the best man's wife wouldn't hear of it. Her grief morphed into bitter blame. "She's the reason my husband is gone. It's her fault I'm left alone." The bride, trembling and pale, crumpled into her mother's arms. Guilt and sorrow weighed heavily on her, her cries barely audible over the chaos. Days later, they held the best man's burial. It was somber and modest, as tradition demanded for someone who passed away so young. Only a small circle of relatives and friends gathered, all dressed in black. Elderly people were not invited. The best man was only 30, far too young for a grand funeral celebration. His wife stood apart, clutching their 2 children, her face etched with pain. Meanwhile, in another hospital room, Nelson stirred. His eyes fluttered open, scanning the room in confusion. Then he spoke, his voice weak but urgent. "Where is Ella? Where is my wife, Ella?" His mother froze, glancing nervously at Mercy, who sat by his bedside. Mercy's heart dropped. "I'm your wife, Nelson," she said softly, her voice trembling. But the look he gave her was cold and unfamiliar, filled with disgust. "Get her away from me!" Nelson yelled, turning to his mother. "Send her away! I want Ella!" Mercy, shattered, turned to the doctor in desperation. "What's going on? Why doesn't he remember me?" The doctor sighed, his tone careful and measured. "He's suffering from memory loss. The trauma from the accident has affected his mind. It's a 50-50 chance whether he'll fully recover, but with the help of loved ones, there's hope." Mercy's world crumbled around her. Tears filled her eyes as she clung to the doctor's words. "Please, you have to help him. I can't lose him. Not to another woman. We've been through so much together." The doctor gave her a sympathetic nod. "We'll do everything we can." But Nelson's rejection was like a knife to her heart. He refused to acknowledge her, his mind stuck on Ella, whoever she was. His mother, caught in the middle, tried to calm him down, pleading with him to listen. "Nelson, this is Mercy. She's your wife," his mother said gently. But Nelson shook his head, his expression hardening. "I don't know her. I want Ella," he insisted. Mercy felt the weight of her love and heartbreak pressing down on her. She couldn't give up, not now. She whispered to herself, "He'll remember me." He has to. Nelson was finally discharged from the hospital, weak but stable, and returned to his mother's care. Mercy, his fiancée, was relieved he was home, but devastated that he no longer remembered her. Day after day, she visited him, holding on to hope. She brought photos of their moments together, trips, birthdays, their engagement day. But Nelson's reaction never changed. "Mercy, where is my wife Ella?" he would ask, his voice filled with desperation. Sometimes he would yell at his mother, "Why are you hiding me from my wife? I need Ella." Mercy's heart shattered a little more each time. With trembling hands, she would try to explain, "Nelson, I'm Mercy, your fiancée. We were about to get married before the accident." But Nelson's mind was stuck on Ella, his ex-wife, whom he believed was his wife. The truth was complicated. Nelson and Ella had been married for 5 years, struggling with infertility. During their darkest moment, Nelson cheated on Ella with his secretary, and she found out, as his secretary was pregnant for him, while they were both struggling to have children on their own. That betrayal ended their marriage. For 5 long months, Mercy cried herself to sleep, clinging to the faint hope that Nelson's memories would return. But instead of getting closer to her, he seemed to drift further away. Nelson wanted nothing to do with her. His entire focus was on finding Ella. Confused and scared, Mercy turned to her closest friends for advice. "His mom thinks I should find Ella and bring her here to help him remember the truth. But I'm terrified. What if he falls for her again and leaves me?" she confided. One of her friends warned, "It's risky. If Ella comes back into the picture, she could take Nelson from you." Another reassured her, "But if you don't try, you might lose him anyway." After agonizing over the decision, Mercy finally tracked Ella down. She found Ella's office address on Instagram and decided to pay her a visit. The moment Ella saw Mercy, her face twisted with anger. "What are you doing here, you homewrecker?" Ella snapped. Mercy stood frozen, swallowing her pride. She wanted to scream back, but instead she pleaded softly, "Ella, I need your help." Ella scoffed and turned to a receptionist. "Make sure this woman never comes here again." But Mercy refused to give up. She followed Ella to her car, her home, and even cafes where she spent time. After days of persistence, Ella finally agreed to meet Mercy at a quiet bar. "What do you want from me?" Ella asked, her tone cold and distant. Mercy poured out the entire story, explaining Nelson's accident and his memory loss. "He thinks you're his wife, Ella. Please, I'm begging you. I need your help to bring him back to reality." Ella laughed bitterly. "Do you hear yourself? You want me to help the man who cheated on me and the woman who ruined my life? You have some nerve, Mercy." Mercy fought back tears. "I know I hurt you, Ella. I'll never forgive myself for that. But this isn't about me. It's about Nelson. Please." Ella's face softened briefly before she shook her head. "I can't do it." Mercy didn't stop begging, and after days of relentless persistence, Ella finally relented. "Fine, I'll help. But only for Nelson, not for you. And let's set some ground rules. No kissing, no romance, and definitely no intimacy." Mercy agreed, grateful for Ella's help, but also fearful of what might happen. Her friends warned her again, "Don't trust Ella completely. Watch her closely." Ella moved into Nelson's apartment to play the role of his wife. She cooked his favorite meals and took care of him, following their agreement. Slowly, Nelson grew more affectionate toward Ella, though she maintained her boundaries. One evening, Nelson tried to kiss her. Ella stepped back, forcing a smile. "Not now, dear. I'm tired." Nelson frowned, confused. "Don't you love me anymore? Why are you avoiding me?" Ella replied gently, "Of course, I love you. I just need some space." Mercy, watching everything unfold, felt her chest tighten. She confronted Ella later. "Remember our agreement. Don't cross the line." Ella asintió. "Relax, Mercy. I'm sticking to the plan." But Nelson began to feel uneasy around Mercy. "Ella, can you talk to her? She's always hovering around. I feel like I can't breathe." Ella tried to calm him. "Mercy is here to help, Nelson. Let's give her some space, too." Eventually, Mercy agreed to stay in the background, but her fears grew with every passing day. She watched Ella and Nelson interact, her heart pounding with jealousy and anxiety. Could she trust Ella to keep her promise? Or was she about to lose the man she loved all over again?